Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're embarking on this really remarkable journey, one that starts right in the heart of southern Africa.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack the story of Botswana. It's a landlocked country that, well, against some pretty incredible odds, managed to transform itself.
Right. From being one of the poorest nations back when it got independence in the 1960s.
Exactly, into this vibrant, stable, middle and even upper income success story.
And what's really insightful, I think, about Botswana's narrative is how it navigated this really complex past, from prehistoric roots all the way through colonial rule, and then somehow forged this unique path, really robust democratic governance, smart economic choices, especially, around its natural resources.
Yeah, and we'll be digging into those insights using our source material, like a brief history of Botswana.pdf and some other related research we've looked at.
That's right.
So our mission today really is to try and figure out the key ingredients in Botswana's recipe for success. Understand the challenges it's still facing, because it's not perfect.
No, definitely not.
And maybe consider what lessons its journey might offer, the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for you, the listener, who's eager for a shortcut to being well-informed?
Well, you'll get a really thorough understanding of a nation often called an African miracle. Oh.
Complete with some surprising facts and maybe a few aha moments, hopefully.
Hopefully. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So to really get a handle on Botswana's incredible journey, we kind of need to rewind way back to its ancient roots, long before we even thought about nations.
Right, pre-colonial times.
For at least the last 200 years, maybe more, this region was home to hunter-gatherer sand communities.
Yeah.
Especially in the Kalahari, that vast desert region.
And what's amazing is their deep environmental knowledge. I mean, adapting to over 100 different arid species of edible plants, game animals, that's an incredible skill.
It really is. And it wasn't just about survival, was it? It left this striking cultural legacy we can actually still see. Absolutely. Botswana has, get this, over 2,000 documented rock painting sites. Mostly up in the northern parts.
2,000, wow.
Yeah. Famous places like Sodilo Hills and the UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Moremi River near Mon. They're known for these ancient artworks.
Okay, those rock paintings sound absolutely stunning. But beyond just, the pictures of animals and things, what stories do they actually tell us about the Sand people and their world back then?
Well, they're like a window into their whole worldview, really. You see hunting scenes, sure. Terrestrial animals, even ocean animals sometimes.
Ocean animals.
Yeah.
And landlocked Botswana.
Well, depictions of them, yeah. Including animals that are around today and some that are extinct. But what's really compelling, I think, are the scenes about mortality, about the spirit world.
Ah, okay.
Sometimes induced apparently by chance, dance, maybe even mind-altering substances.
Yeah.
It just paints this vivid picture of really complex beliefs and this profound connection they had to their environment.
It's fascinating. Then, around AD 200, things started to change quite dramatically, didn't they?
Yeah, the dynamic shifted. Bantu agriculturalists, specifically the Botswana people, started migrating down from equatorial Africa.
And they reached modern-day Botswana about 1,000 years ago.
Roughly, yeah. And their arrival really impacted the sand communities already living there.
Oh, so?
Well, these farming communities, they gradually infiltrated the areas and over time outnumbered the hunter-gatherers. And this led to, periods of conflict, sometimes cultural assimilation, but ultimately often the marginalization of the sand communities. Our source even mentions that some Swana men held a, quote, distaste and an untenable stereotype towards the sand.
Right, which must have contributed to that shift in power and status.
Definitely.
It helps to picture the traditional sand society that was being impacted, though.
You mentioned hunter-gatherers.
Right. They lived in these small nomadic bands, maybe 10 to 50 people, temporary huts, incredibly skilled hunters using poisoned, barb-tipped arrows or snares.
For what kind of game? Antelope, rodents, birds, whatever they could find. And they were expert gatherers too. Nuts, tubers, bulbs, fruit. They even figured out how to dig wells and line them with animal hides for water.
Wow. Resourceful.
Incredibly. Using animal hides for shields, plant poison, or fatty acids as ointments. Even using roots to detect illness, apparently. Just deeply attuned to their environment and remarkably self-sufficient.
Their story really highlights that deep adaptation and rich culture that existed long before others arrived. But, like so much of Africa, Botswana's path was drastically altered by, well, external forces.
Yeah, colonialism.
When did European interests really start to shape things in this specific region?
That's the key point. I mean, you had Portuguese and Dutch presence in southern Africa earlier, 17th, 18th centuries.
Hmm.
The Dutch settling Cape Colony in 1652.
Right.
But the real game changer for what became Bechuanaland was in the 19th century, and maybe surprisingly, it wasn't initially about like grand colonial administration.
So what was the trigger for the British getting involved?
It really seems to have been the arrival of mining prospectors. That's what grabbed British attention.
Ah, resources.
Exactly. Securing resources, securing a strategic pathway north. This led to a protectorate being sort of concluded with the local chiefs on March 31st, 1885.
Okay.
Formally proclaimed a few months later, June 27th. The capital even got shifted to Mafeking, which is actually outside the protectorate's borders, interestingly.
Huh. And there were challenges early on.
Oh, yeah. Boer commando invasions in 1895 and 1897, which the British managed to resist.
So this British rule, this indirect rule, what was it actually like on the ground?
It was distinct. They initially saw the chiefs as useful administrators, intermediaries,
All right.
though they apparently worried about them being susceptible to bribery.
Oh, okay.
But here's the crucial thing the source highlights. The British colonial policy was characterized as dilatory and unimaginative, meaning slow, neglectful, basically. It resulted in no appreciable development of resources. So think inadequate water supply, terrible roads, hardly any telephones, no real energy infrastructure, poor health services, legally segregated education.
So pretty underdeveloped.
Very. Though it's worth noting the source does say Botswana was not subjected to the same hunger of rapacity rule seen in other exploited colonies in Africa at the time. So perhaps less brutal exploitation, but more neglect.
Right. And this neglect, it had its own kind of impact, didn't it?
It really did. Paradoxically, British indirect rule ended up strengthening the existing network of Tswana chiefs. The source calls them paternal vital masters.
So instead of breaking down old power structures, it kind of reinforced them.
Precisely. The colonial system, rather than dismantling hierarchies, sort of solidified the pre-colonial ones, and unfortunately this enhanced pre-colonial inequities. It reinforced existing beliefs that justified Tswana domination over other groups like the Basarwa, the San.
How were the San affected during this period?
They were further marginalized, really pushed to the fringes, often regarded as, quote, primitive and uncivilized or useless, not just by the colonial state, but also by some Tswana, sometimes even seen as subhuman because their traditional lifestyle was changing or misunderstood.
Wow.
And this also, crucially, cut off Bazarwa from the social networks, which tied them into a broader collective identity, really isolating them.
So a period where existing divisions were kind of deepened, and then there was this really crucial moment involving Sir Seretse Khama, an Oxford graduate anti-apartheid figure.
Yeah, a major figure.
How did South Africa's apartheid regime get involved in his story, and what was the local reaction?
Well, South Africa's government put immense pressure on the British. They did not want Khama, an anti-apartheid leader married to a white British woman, Ruth Williams, gaining political power in neighboring Bechuanaland.
Understandable from their perspective, I guess.
Right, but this interference, this attempt to exile him, did not go down well with the indigenous people at all. It actually led to this heated groundswell of support for Khama.
So it backfired on the British and the South Africans.
Completely. The popular support was so strong, it ultimately forced the British to allow him to return in 1956. It was a really clear demonstration of the people's will against colonial meddling.
Okay, so we have this British policy dilatory and unimaginative, leaving the place underdeveloped. But this also meant, as the source puts it, a kind of political void compared to other African colonies where anti-colonial movements were really intense.
Yeah, that's a really interesting paradox.
How did that strange neglect actually shape Botswana's path towards governing itself?
Well, because the British were relatively hands-off administratively, Bechuanaland wasn't caught up in the same kind of violent, protracted anti-colonial struggles you saw elsewhere.
Right.
This allowed for a more, let's say, organic development of local political thinking and structures. For instance, they already had this tradition of the gutla.
The village assemblies.
Exactly, where pretty much all adults would gather, discuss issues, resolve disputes, make community decisions, a real grassroots system of natural justice based on consensus.
But didn't the colonial government interfere with the Kagatla?
They did. The source says they insulted such tradition by putting the Kagatla under the direct control of government administrative officers. So there was definitely that tension between traditional ways and imposed rule.
Did this unique environment, this mix of neglect and tradition, lead to the rise of formal political parties?
It seems to have fostered it, yes. You had this combination of limited colonial interference but strong local traditions, and from that emerged nationally focused parties, like the Botswana Democratic Party, the BDP, formed by M.K. Moga. Oh wait, the source actually credits Sir Seretse Khama with forming the BDP in 1960. Moga came later.
Oh, okay. Kama and the BDP in 1960, and other parties.
Yes, also the Botswana National Front, or BNF. So political organizations started bubbling up. Remember, the British only really exercised limited indirect rule until after World War II?
And then things sped up.
A bit. A Western-style democratic electoral system was finally introduced in 1965. That led to some degree of internal self-government.
And the BDP, led by Kama, was central to the final push for independence.
Absolutely. They were instrumental in the preparations. Interestingly, they actually postponed the independent state until 1966, perhaps to ensure things were properly set up.
And so, Botswana gained independence on October 30th, 1966, from Britain. The Botswanaland Protectorate became the Republic of Botswana on that day.
And here's that really unique detail you mentioned earlier. Independence was granted without a change of constitution.
Right. It just transformed from a protectorate to a self-governing territory under the same unaltered Act of 1885. That's quite something.
It really is. It shows this unusual continuity within a moment of massive change.
Yeah.
And since '66, Botswana has had this remarkably long period of peace, stability, relative prosperity.
Navigating challenges, obviously.
Of course, but with a strong foundation. Sir Seretse Khama, as the first president, really prioritized key things, establishing democratic institutions, making sure there was a clear separation of powers, building a stable, non-corrupt civil service.
Rule of law.
Absolutely. Rule of law, promoting dialogue, and actively working to prevent racial and tribal conflict. That focus was critical.
That dedication to good governance seems like the bedrock. But you need more than just good governance for economic transformation, right? What actually fueled Botswana's incredible development?
Well, that good governance enabled the economic transformation. It wasn't just luck. Botswana went from being one of the poorest countries in the world in the 60s to a middle, even upper middle income country. It's seen as a major success story by development economists.
And the growth was significant.
Hugely significant real GDP per capita growth. It became sub-Saharan Africa's highest performing economy in the late 20th century, a ninefold increase between 1966 and 1997.
Ninefold, wow. And the source attributes this
to sound economic management, proper fiscal discipline, sound policies, a well-defined vision, and, crucially, prudent use of diamond revenue.
Prudent use of diamond revenue. We'll definitely come back to diamonds.
Yeah.
But how did their democratic system itself help maintain this stability and growth?
It was integral, really. Botswana is widely regarded as having one of the most enlightened democratic systems in the world. It's a thriving, multi-party parliamentary democracy.
And stable.
Incredibly stable. It has never experienced a coup d'etat, armed rebellion, or major civil unrest. The rule of law, civil liberties largely upheld throughout its history.
And the Constitution.
Adopted in 1966, it's described as a powerful document. It protects ethnic and cultural rights, allows for broad participation. And what's really interesting is how they adapted the British parliamentary system.
How so?
Well, for example, they have a motion of no confidence that can be brought by opposition MPs, which is a check on power. That's different from, say, a presidential veto system like in the US, or even the specific conventions in Britain. And they made the judiciary totally independent.
So they tailored the system.
Exactly. A thoughtful, adapted approach to governance, not just a carbon copy.
That structural integrity sounds vital. Okay, let's dive into that core economic engine you mentioned, diamonds. Botswana, one of the world's top producers. What was the big turning point?
The turning point was definitely the discovery of the Orapa kimberlite pipe in 1961. This led to what became known as the richest diamond mine on Earth.
Right. And diamonds are really credited with Botswana's wealth.
Largely, yes. The source says it illustrates how science, technology, and human capital combined, through a mutual agency, to build a nation like no other in Africa.
Meaning local capacity working with international know-how.
Exactly. And the impact of diamonds goes beyond their contribution to GDP, FDI, foreign direct investment, and employment. It's rated as profound and extraordinary for national development.
And they made a key decision about ownership, didn't they?
A very strategic one. Early on, the government ensured it maintained a significant share in Botswana, the joint venture company with De Beers. This meant a large chunk of the profits stayed within Botswana.
Smart move. But it wasn't only diamonds that helped diversify things later on, right? Tourism came into play.
Yeah, that's important too. At independence, there was basically no tourism industry to speak of. But in the mid-1980s, they started to leverage the country's incredible natural beauty.
The Okavango Delta.
That's the iconic one. The source mentions the now ubiquitous image of the Okavango Delta as a prime safari spot. That really fueled a tourism boom in the 1990s.
And tourism is a significant part of the economy now.
It is. Contributes about 5% of GDP, over 10% of employment, and crucially, it's seen as a renewable resource, unlike the diamond mines, which will eventually run out.
Okay, so diamonds and tourism, huge drivers. But there's a paradox here, isn't there? All this wealth, did it reach everyone?
That's the big question, and the source suggests not entirely. Despite the immense wealth, Botswana has struggled to translate this wealth into significant economic advancement for the majority of its people. There are doubts about the inclusiveness of this growth.
How does that play out in tourism specifically?
Well, the model they adopted was mostly high-end, low-volume tourism. While maybe good for conservation in some ways, it has left many Botswana at the wayside.
Why is that?
Often, expatriates dominate the management and ownership side of the industry, and much of the profit still ends up overseas.
Right, so the benefits don't always trickle down effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And it's led to this phenomenon called enclave tourism. Visitors come, they stay in these beautiful lodges, see the wildlife.
But they don't really connect with local life.
Pretty much. They rarely experience what life is like for Botswana or spend much time or money in local villages. The connection beyond maybe the guides isn't always strong.
So this tension between national wealth and unequal distribution, how did it show up in other social changes and challenges post-independence?
That's a critical link. One huge social change was urban migration, especially among young people.
Why was that happening?
High birth rates combined with falling death rates meant the youth population boomed. Opportunities or perceived opportunities were often in urban areas. This led to increased density there and a corresponding squeeze in rural areas.
And unemployment.
Youth unemployment, unfortunately, rose quite dramatically, from around 37% in 1964 to nearly 49% by 2002. It shows that industrialization and wealth generation didn't automatically create enough jobs for everyone, especially young people.
So the social structures were definitely evolving under these economic pressures. Did they try to address this through things like education?
They did. There was a big educational reform process from 1977 to 1988. The aim was to strengthen the system, make it more relevant to what the nation needed and aspired to be.
What were the main goals?
Things like education for social justice, economic development, unity, and to promote inquiry. Pretty ambitious goals.
And were they successful?
Well, the source notes that the initially proposed reforms fell short of government approval. So what was actually implemented in 1984 ended up being narrower in scope. Reforms happened, yes, but perhaps not as comprehensive as first hoped.
Okay. What about healthcare? That's often a big indicator of development.
Botswana actually developed a pretty extensive network of health facilities. Public hospitals, private ones, church-owned, community clinics, health posts, even mobile clinics.
And access.
Public sector healthcare is almost free to citizens. Apparently up to 85% of the population uses public facilities. It's a tiered system, with the Ministry of Health setting policy.
Sounds quite comprehensive. Any drawbacks mentioned?
Yeah, one specific point was about health education assistance, the people crucial for community health promotion out in the villages. They were noted for not having proper working methods, adequate facilities and materials, and also lack program guidelines.
So challenges in the actual delivery on the ground, even with good infrastructure.
Seems like it. Operational hurdles in making the system work perfectly at the community level.
Now, we have to talk about the elephant in the room for Botswana during this period, HIV/AIDS.
Absolutely. It became tragically the greatest challenge confronting Botswana.
The statistics were terrifying, weren't they?
Devastating. An estimated prevalence of almost 30% of the population at one point. That's nearly 1 in 3 people.
Unimaginable.
It was seen as depleting productivity and degrading the standards of living. There were fears the country could become a biological desert, projections of 130,000 AIDS orphans doubling by 2010. It was an existential threat.
Just devastating.
It was. But here's where Botswana's story takes another remarkable turn. Their response.
What did they do?
They were incredibly proactive and effective. In August 2002, they introduced free and voluntary, highly active, antiretroviral treatment HART.
Free treatment for everyone who needed it.
Yes. And this led to Probably the highest treatment coverage anywhere in the world at that time. The impact was massive. By
Mhm.
2007, an estimated 250,000 people were alive who likely would have died without access to art.
That's an incredible public health achievement. 250,000 lives saved.
It really is. And alongside treatment, they had prevention initiatives like the Botswana Messenger of Hope, using youth advocates to promote abstinence and safe practices. This also contributed to a dramatic fall in new infections after 2003.
Wow. A real testament to political will and using resources effectively, even in a crisis.
Absolutely.
Okay, so major strides in health, but other challenges remained. What about the environment, particularly for things like farming?
Yeah, that's a persistent issue. Despite diverse geography, very little of the land in Botswana is considered agricultural. It's just not suited for settled farming in most places. Lack of surface water is a big one. Temperature extremes, frost damage in some areas. So drought is a constant worry, and declining underground water supplies are very real problems. That puts a major constraint on agriculture.
And that links back to inequality, perhaps, if agriculture is difficult.
It certainly can. And on social inequality more broadly, the source is quite clear. Even with all the economic growth and efforts to reduce poverty, most of the benefits of growth had accrued to the rich.
How do they measure that?
Using Gini coefficients, which measure income distribution, census data showed widening inequality between 1981 and 1999.
So the gap between rich and poor actually grew during that period of high growth.
It seems so. Critics argued Botswana failed to fully achieve its own Vision 2016 goal of becoming a compassionate and caring society. They pointed to the parsimony, meaning the stinginess, perhaps, of its welfare policies compared to other places like Mauritius.
Interesting comparison. So a complex picture internally. How did Botswana position itself externally on the world stage?
Regional cooperation has always been a big priority. Botswana is a key member of SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community.
Focusing on what within SADC?
Things like trade, shared water resources, agriculture, transport, health practical cooperation. Botswana also pushes for dialogue on reforming SADC itself and encourages regional leadership.
And beyond the region.
Globally, they maintain warm and friendly relations with all countries, really valuing their independence and freedom to choose partners. And importantly, their credible and honest accounting of its donors' performance and behavior has apparently helped them build strong relationships.
Meaning they're seen as trustworthy partners.
Seems like it. This has allowed them to work successfully with influential bilateral partners like the U.S., Great Britain, Japan, South Africa, and multilateral organizations.
Looking ahead then, they built these strong foundations. There's that quote from a former president. It is wrong to build a house and then, on completion, start to build the foundations.
Yeah, highlighting that careful step-by-step approach to building their democracy and institutions.
But even with solid foundations, what are the big challenges and opportunities moving forward, especially diversifying the economy away from just diamonds?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? They've made huge strides against HIV/AIDS, but that remains an ongoing challenge. Diversification is key. They've tried to boost the beef cattle industry.
Right. Botswana beef is quite famous.
It is, but it's faced setbacks like foot and mouth disease outbreaks. And exploring more agricultural potential runs up against those environmental limits we talked about. Limited land, scarce water.
So diversification beyond mining and cattle is tricky.
It is. It really raises the question, how will Botswana diversify effectively? They're looking into things like the knowledge economy, financial services, maybe leveraging their stability for that. Renewable energy could be another area, given the sunshine. And this ties into the Sustainable Development Goals.
Ah, yes, the SDGs. How are they approaching those global goals?
They're committed to the 2030 agenda, and they recognize they need better local data to track progress effectively. But importantly, the source stresses that implementing the SDGs needs to be hinged on clear and broad societal and governmental frameworks.
And connecting to local values.
Exactly. And specifically on the African ethos of Botho.
Botho, what does that mean?
It's a concept found in many Bantu languages, essentially meaning humanity, or I am because we are. It emphasizes interconnectedness, community, human dignity. The idea is that development has to be rooted in these values, serving the well-being of everyone.
So development can't just be top-down.
Precisely. The source warns the agenda cannot be driven and owned solely by government and should not be an exercise ahead of the people with little on the ground. It has to be participatory, involving the whole nation.
So wrapping this up then, what does it all mean? We've traced this really extraordinary journey from a British protectorate characterized by well, neglect and inherited inequalities, to becoming this beacon of peace, stability, and pretty remarkable economic growth in Africa. It's a story of managing resources, well, at least initially,
Prudent management, yeah.
a deep commitment to democratic institutions, and this incredibly courageous, data-driven response to that massive HIV/AIDS crisis.
And Botswana's experience really does offer some powerful lessons, I think. It shows that even when you're facing daunting challenges, landlocked, initially very poor, difficult neighborhood, sometimes strategic leadership, consistent policy, and actually engaging your people can lead to profound national transformation.
But it's not a simple fairy tale.
No, not at all. It also highlights that ongoing struggle. How do you ensure the benefits of economic growth actually reach every citizen? How do you make growth truly inclusive? And how do you keep traditional values, like Botho, central as you modernize and face global goals? It's about bridging that gap between national economic success and genuine equitable well-being for all.
This has been quite the deep dive. For you, the listener, maybe something to consider is this. How does a nation, one that's rich in resources and genuinely committed to democracy, make sure that its economic success translates into fair social development for absolutely everyone,
Yeah.
while also holding on to its unique cultural heritage and adapting to massive global challenges like climate change, which we know is hitting Southern Africa hard? What's that delicate balance between driving development forward quickly and making sure that progress is truly inclusive and sustainable?
Lots to think about there.
Definitely. We hope this deep dive leaves you with plenty to mull over and maybe inspires you to explore Botswana's continuing story even further.